Hey everyone, Tin Man here with part 2 of my positioning guide for Dota Underlords. Make sure you check out part 1 if you haven't, as this video will build on topics discussed there. Link in the description below. Just to quickly recap, in part 1 we covered zones of control and how we can manipulate them to dictate which units target which other units in combat. That helps us to control mana gain, as well as protecting our more vulnerable units. We also covered how we can stack into corners to exploit opposing positionings to focus fire down key targets quickly. The last topic we discussed was how the geometry of certain abilities and passives influence how we position around them. In this video, I'll discuss how to position assassins, who basically break all of the rules of positioning. That will lead into a discussion of how to counter opposing strategies, and finally look at how to scout out opponents in the late game and how to adjust based on what you see. First up, a traditional assassins lineup. Assassins have very different movement mechanics from other units in the game. Rather than simply walking forward towards the nearest enemy, they will leap to the furthest enemy at the start of the fight, even if there is another enemy in range. For anyone who has played other auto chess variants, this is a change. In other games, assassins would stay put and not leap if there was an enemy in range of them at the start of the fight. This means that all of our normal rules for placement go out the window for assassins. They are typically placed in the backline though, to prevent any opposing units from getting a quick attack in on them right before they leap. As far as I can tell, if you have multiple assassins, the positioning of each of them on the backline has essentially no impact on where they jump or who they target, since they jump to the furthest target, but the furthest target for one assassin is probably the same furthest target for another. It comes down to some RNG to determine who gets there first. The only situation where the exact positioning may matter is the case where your opponents have a single unit split off to the side like this. In this case, the assassins who are closer to that side may or may not jump to the gyrocopter, preferring instead to leap over to the clump of mages on the left. You can adjust the side of your assassins are on to encourage or avoid this, but even so, with how random the assassin's movement seems to be, I'm not entirely sure that this is accurate. If you just leave them all on the backline, you'll do fine. The last thing to mention about the assassin composition is the relatively few frontliners that they have. Typically, assassin builds will have just one or two, as shown here with Treant Protector and Lone Druid. These want to be placed forward of the assassins and roughly central. Notice the huge zones of control that these two units have, since they are the only frontliners. Treant is placed forward since he is more resilient due to the elusive trait, and Lone Druid is offset for the same reasons we discussed in part 1. This means that most, if not all, opposing units will target them, focus firing attacks on these two initially. This is actually ideal in this build, since assassins have very little defensive capability themselves, and hopefully they can get a couple quick kills on the opposing backline before they get through the Treant and turn on the assassins. Treant Protector is probably the best unit in the game right now for this type of solo or duo tanking role, due to the combination of his high health total and the elusive trait offering a high percentage damage reduction. You see this type of concept in other elusive builds like with Hunters, where Treant Protector is placed far forward of the rest of the team to draw all fire away from the less resilient damage dealers. Now that we understand how assassins are positioned, how do we counter them, if our opponents are playing them? A simple box formation is an effective counter to assassins. The highest damage dealing units are placed closer to the corner, and the more resilient units are placed on the outer edge. Since assassins jump very quickly at the start, most of your units will not move much by the time the assassins land. This is best to protect your high important damage dealers for as long as possible. This is actually the normal formation for mages as shown here. Other compositions can also use this to great effect, like Hunters, which also stacks efficiently around Drow Ranger. Warriors can also use this to some extent, but it requires somewhat counterintuitive play of placing melee units on the backline, potentially surrounding them by other units. This can work well versus assassins, but it will weaken you against non-assassin compositions, since those units will take more time to get into combat and start attacking. Continuing on the theme of how to counter different formations, how do we counter these box formations? Well, if you're playing assassins, it's pretty difficult, since you cannot change their movement mechanics. But you can include AoE effects like Kunkka, Enigma, or Disruptor, which heavily punish them for stacking up. Any type of composition can include these AoE units to counter a box formation, but there are also potential ways to counter them as well using positioning. In the case of mages, shown here, they want to fight you straight on. They want you to be more or less lined up so that you fight Kunkka and Ogre Magi first, while the damage dealers like Shadow Fiend and Keeper of Light get to charge their mana. Knights also want the same front to back style of fight. They want you to fight Abaddon and Omni Knight first, while Dragon Knight in the back pumps out the damage. So to counter them, you need to split up your formation. This prevents their AoE effects from hitting your entire team, and also tries to get units to flank around their front line to hit more vulnerable targets in the back. By splitting up, you also give the chance for knights to move in opposite directions, pulling them apart and reducing the effectiveness of their alliance. How about hunters, who also want to focus fire? How can we counter them? In this case, if you place all of your units on the opposite corner, they will not initially be in range of most of the hunters, causing them to move. And since movement is somewhat chaotic, they will lose a lot of their focus fire potential, splitting their damage across multiple targets. Do note that if this is the opposing formation and you want to be in the opposite corner, you need to have your units in the bottom left as well on your own board. Then they will appear in the top right when combat starts. How about warriors, who are in a line up front? They want to get into combat quickly with all of their units, and get fast mana on important CC units like Kunkka and Pudge. There are two ways to counter this. The first is our old friend, the corner box formation. This limits the number of available squares that the mostly melee lineup has to access your units. You can potentially strand some of the units for a while, since there is no place for them to move in for melee attacks. Notice that there are only 7 tiles in melee range, but there were 8 opposing warriors. This can also let you focus fire damage on key targets like the Lycan or Doom, who are normally put at the edge of warrior formations. The other option is to put your formation into the back lines. By setting your formation back off the front, you force the warriors to move forward, and once again, movement is chaotic, which means that they may block each other from getting into melee range. You can also avoid focusing attacks on their main tank units. As they move forward, they will constantly be peppered from attacks by your trolls in the back and Medusa. In this example, it also has the benefit of making it harder for your opponents to target counter your Tidehunter. More on that next. The common theme in all of these examples is that you need to identify what your opponents are trying to accomplish, and then don't let the fight play out the way that they want it to. Assassins want to hit vulnerable units, mages and knights want a nice clean front to back kind of fight, hunters want to focus fire, and warriors want to get into combat quickly and easily. By adjusting your formation, you can prevent playing into their strengths and give yourself an advantage. I want to stress that most of this counterplay comes later in the game, once some players have been eliminated, and you can better estimate who you may play against. Earlier on, when there are 7 possible opponents, this type of adjustment is unlikely to matter since you can't predict who you will play against. The last thing I want to discuss is the other types of late game adjustment called targeted positioning. This involves mostly minor changes to your formation that can absolutely make or break a key late game fight. It involves targeting specific enemy units that are important to the fight and then making a small adjustment to counter it. Typically, these only occur when there are only 2 players left, so you know for sure who you will face each round. Let's look at a late game example. There are some units in the game like Tidehunter, Kunkka, and Disruptor which have massive impact on the late game. Their abilities either stun or silence a large part of the opponent's team, which can dramatically swing a fight in your favor. The difference between a win and a loss can be as simple as whose Tidehunter or Disruptor triggers first in a fight. Imagine this is the opponent's formation, and you see that they have a Disruptor that you need to deal with. One option is to position in separate groups so that the ult only hits one group. A better option, though, if you have it, is to utilize either Anti-Mage or humans with the Human Alliance to attempt to prevent them from casting at all. To do this, you need to be aware that the units you position are opposite to your normal perspective. If a unit looks like it is in the lower left of your board, it will appear in the upper right on the opponent's board. That means if their Disruptor is just left of center here, when you scout out their board, you need to place your human or anti-mage just right of center on your board on the blue square in front of Alchemist. This type of mirrored positioning extends for the entire board, so if they moved their Disruptor to a spot labeled A, you will have to adjust your anti-mage or human to the opposite spot labeled A, and so on. Another option is to simply leave the columns that their Disruptor is completely empty. Then hopefully none of your units will attack them right away, limiting their mana gain, and delaying their abilities until you have already won the fight. Remember that opposing Disruptor will be in the highlighted spot here, so we'll leave as much of a gap around it as possible. This does look similar to a split group formation, but that's only because the Disruptor is in the center. If we saw them move their Disruptor to, say, this space, then we could adjust accordingly and stack further away from it, once again to avoid attacking it and giving it mana. As you can probably imagine, this devolves into a sort of cat and mouse game later, when one player moves their units and the other has to quickly move and counter it. This can require constant scouting and adjustment in a 1v1 scenario, because key units and abilities can really swing their fight on their own. The other important note with this is that if the targeted units are off the front line, as we saw from this example earlier, it becomes harder to target them specifically due to the somewhat random nature of movement. Tidehunter here is pretty close to the front, but if you wanted to get an anti-mage, say, onto the Enigma off to the left, it would be very difficult since he is so far back. There is a trade-off though. The Enigma will take less damage and gain less mana, but it's also harder to counter. The last late game adjustment you can make against strong AoE abilities is to try to bait them into the corners of the board. Since every ability currently in the game targets a specific unit, often at random, if all of your units are stacked up right next to each other, an opposing AoE effect will hit them all, regardless of who it targets. By placing units like this, with one unit on each of the 4 corners of your board, you give a chance for something like Enigma to target the Necrophos here, rather than your large clump in the middle. But this tactic is much less reliable since targeting is somewhat random, but it can be a useful tool in your arsenal when it does work. That does it for this guide. I hope that between this video and part 1, you learned some new ideas about proper positioning. It is very complex and highly dependent on the exact units and levels that you have, as well as the units and levels that your opponents have. If you enjoyed this video, please do like and subscribe and turn on notifications to keep up to date with all of my upcoming Dota Underlords content. I have also recently launched a Patreon, so I'll be taking my notes, scripts, and other materials that I prepare for these videos and posting them up on there, as well as taking suggestions and ideas for future content. If you like this type of content and want to keep it coming, please do consider supporting me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.